So I have to start where I ended last week, or where we went too quickly, and redo it and make it clearer. So I have two main source things. These are three, okay. One is Jewish sources. Jewish meaning like very late, very far down the chain of thinking, because they're not the people that started thinking about this. And the second is Aristotle, the second chapter, where we were sort of up to in our thing. The second chapter of the second book of the Anima. Now they're talking about the same question. That's really why I remember what I spoke about last week about the Shemana Prakim. So let's try to start from the philosophy and see if we can get to the Yiddishkeit. So let's try to go back to where we were. Where we were, in the order of him trying to think through this question of what the soul is, was that we got a general definition of the soul, right? If you remember, which is the first actuality of an organic body, things like that. Now the thing with this definition is that it's very general. What does general mean? It's really a definition of a definition. My friend, the gray guy, calls it a meta definition, because it really is defining what kind of thing the soul is, right? It didn't talk about any soul, right? It says soul is this kind, like there's different kinds of forms or different kinds. So the soul is the kind of form that is the thing that, or we could call it like the principle or the actuality of a body. That's the kind of thing, and it's a specific kind of form, like we tried to explain. So that's what most general kind of being it is. It doesn't tell us really what it is in a specific way. Or another way of saying this is, that's one way of saying it. It's a very general definition. Another way of saying this, like what we're missing here, is it doesn't tell us anything different, or what makes different kinds of souls different, right? For example, and this was very important for Aristotle, we discussed this, that it's not enough to talk about a human soul, because humans are not the only things that are alive, and he's very confused why almost every previous philosopher discussed the soul as means the human soul, and these things are just confused. Some of them didn't, but he thinks that this is a basic confusion that people have, that they think only humans have souls, and why? A lot of things are alive. But one of his basic questions when he started the book was to figure out, are they alive in the same way? Which is another way of saying, do they have the same soul? Just to be clear. Right? Because soul is just a word for aliveness. So now the previous definition that we just gave, the general definition, the chapter 1 definition, is a general definition, which means it applies to humans just as it applies to horses, or just as it applies to pieces of grass. So what is not only a general definition that needs more particular, we need to explain what this human soul, well, maybe it's the same thing, maybe it's just that, but probably not, because they're alive in different ways. So we need to explain what makes it different. So the more specific story of this soul. So those are two things that we're missing in the first chapter, or the more general definition. A third thing that we could say we're missing, or which sort of comes out of you'll see how all these questions connect. Just trying to present it like this, is that we're missing the discussion, and this was like a second question. If you go back to the beginning of the book, where he wants to give us what are the things that we need to know. We need to know what the soul is, or what the definition of it is, what the essence of it is, and then we need to know its part. In other words, does it have parts? If it does, what kind of parts does it have? Does it have separable parts? Does it have inseparable parts? And so on. So really, what we're missing is also the discussion of the parts of the soul. Now you understand that these questions are very close to each other if they're not the same exact one. Because asking what part the soul has, or what kind of parts it has, all the questions about parts of the soul have very much to do. You could theoretically try to say, and you can't really, but you would think that you could try to give just a formal definition, or a general definition of different parts of it. But once you want to talk about parts, you really need to get into the same question of the specific soul. So for example, you would say, and that's why if you read Shemana Prakim Perek Aleph, he connects these two questions, and we discussed this last week, or at least in my view, he connects them. Right? You could start to say, for example, human beings have all these kinds of livingness in them, right? They're both growing as plants, and both moving or sensing as animals, and thinking as humans. And if the thing that makes animals move, and the thing that makes plants grow and so on are different things, then humans seem to have more than one soul. Or if they're not, so the question, then they don't, or then maybe it's different, maybe it's the one that's in the human is different than the one in the animal. We could say all kinds of different things, but this third question, which is, does the soul have parts and what kind of parts, very much connected to the question of how do we sort of cut up this most general concept of livingness into the different kinds of a livingness that we recognize, which for example at least are the different kinds of livingness that we see in animals versus plants versus humans versus angels maybe, or gods, and all of them which exist sort of within one human, right? So these are three main ways which we can see that we're still missing something very basic to understand what's going on. A fourth way, which Aristotle himself starts with, so in one sense he started, if you go in the end of chapter 1, he sort of said this, that we still don't know if the soul, this was his language, if the soul is separable, or didn't say the word separable over there, but if the soul is like the sailor of a ship, which was Plato's mashal, Plato's example, where he says the sailor is the one that moves the ship, but he's not the ship, he can walk off the ship and go on being a mover, right? And is the soul like that? Which sort of he already answered, but what he's trying to get at is there a part of it that's like that, and so on. That was one question. But then the real question, and if you look in here, I have one. If you look in this thing, it's the first thing that he seems to say, or yeah, he says this. It says this in the first paragraph. If you'll figure out how it says it, then you're smart. But I'm going to tell you what it says. What it says is that we still don't have an explanation of the soul, a cause of the soul. So what this means is, and he gives example of a mathematical definition. And this is important for his way of understanding everything, or what definitions are, or what explanations are. Let me see how I wrote it for myself. Yeah, it's here. Yeah, so what he says is, and this is the fourth thing that we're missing, and then we'll try to answer all these questions. What we're missing is, we just give you like a sentence. The sentence was, the soul is the actuality of a living body, right? In other words, we ask like a question, what is the soul, right? And we say it's alive. What is the aliveness, or same thing? What is the soul? And we said, well, it's the actuality of the body. Okay, so we sort of gave a sort of empty definition, because we didn't tell you. We could call it like the formal cause, but even though formal causes are supposed to cause things, right? They actually explain things. They tell you this is what it is, but we didn't actually explain what it is that we're even explaining. That's another way of we have to be clear, right? So, for example, we're missing the thing, or he calls it a cause, or the thing that explains what it is, or what causes the body to be alive. Or another way of saying it is that we didn't really give a good definition of what alive is yet. Only very general. Like we said, alive are natural things that at least have nutrition. That was all that he told us before. And that's not very well. And even just has nutrition is just like the conclusion, right? It doesn't tell us what gives it nutrition, or what makes it nutrition, or what's the relation between this nutrition and the being alive, right? Being alive is just like the conclusion. So the way he looks at it, because he thinks that all knowledge is like a syllogism. So he thinks that real knowledge would have to have a middle term. That's what Aristotle, according to Aristotle, all knowledge is looking for the middle term of the syllogism. So in other words, we could say, right, the famous example of the syllogism would be all, well, how's it go? All humans are mortal, right? Socrates is immortal, so Socrates is a human, so Socrates is mortal, right? So in other words, if I would just tell you Socrates is a mortal human, I told you the sort of the conclusion of the syllogism, right? So it's true. It's a good definition. What is Socrates? He's a mortal human being, right? A mortal meaning that he dies. So it doesn't even explain something. Why does he die? Because he's mortal. It's just said the same thing again, right? But if I sort of understand that there's like a cloud, there's the general, there's something called human, right? For him, logic is about things, not about formal logic. It's not about just the structure of arguments. It's about understanding things. But that's another thing. If I have the general rule, or the general fact, truth, that all humans are mortal, right? Now I could use this via the middle term to explain, to actually give you the cause of Socrates' death. The cause of Socrates' death was, well, the approximate cause was that he got the people mad. But the cause of Socrates' death ultimately is that because he is human. So the Socrates is a human, for him, is not just like just a little logic game. It's really giving you a cause or an explanation for why did Socrates die, because he is human. And when I just ask you a question, why did Socrates die, saying Socrates is immortal, I just say that, I didn't really explain anything. But the middle term is what makes us understand things, what gives the actual explanation for, another way to say it was the how did it happen, or how did Socrates get dead, or how did he get connected to this death, because he's a human. So and that means something. That's not just like a game. That means something. Like look at Socrates, you'll see he's a human. It's also something that you could know, by the way. It's not just something that we just made up. It's something that usually something that you could also know or see, or at least, or almost see. Right? In the same way, he gives his example that he gives. His example is actually clearer. I should use his example. I'm just trying to explain why all understanding is finding the middle term. It's not enough. This is very important because people think that Aristotle is playing word games, but he doesn't think that he's playing word games.
This is in terms of a specific or a general definition of the soul.
No, this is why the general is only like the conclusion of an argument or of a syllogism, but doesn't give the cause. The more specific, I'll tell you in a minute, an example of a more specific understanding of the soul. Why only the more specific could give you the why or the cause. General definition is like saying Socrates is a mortal human. That which is said, soul is the activity of the actuality of a body, of a living body. But what he's looking for is to do something like a living body is alive. It's alive because it has some kind of thing in it, some kind of principle that makes it alive, and then we'll identify that with the soul. Say that that's what the soul is. But he's missing this middle thing meanwhile, because he just jumped sort of to the conclusion, or just give you the conclusion as a sort of like a definition in words, or an empty definition, but we didn't give you the why. Okay? And you'll see in a minute why the why is specific. I need to give you one more example for sort of understanding what example that he gives for why. He gives an example of geometry. Okay? And he says, I could talk to you about, okay, I hope you follow. He says I can give you an example of another example for what the difference between giving a general definition is, or I'm calling it now general definition, giving like the conclusion is, and actually giving the cause, right? So he says, if I ask you what is squaring, okay, squaring means finding the area of a square or equilateral square that all the sides are the same to be the same as a rectangle. That's what squaring means, at least in his definition. Okay, now what is it? I just told you, exactly. Thank you very much, by the way. I just had to explain it, so I told you. Squaring is the finding of the area of the equilateral square that's the same as an oblong square, like the same of a rectangle. That's what squaring is, okay? Is that very helpful for me to square? Not very helpful. Doesn't explain me how to do squaring, right? So he says, if I want to give you the cause of squaring, or the middle term for squaring, or if you want to understand this better, not just have like sort of a definition that just tells me like, yeah, that's where I want to get at when I want to square something. But how do I get at it? That's, in other words, what's the cause of squaring? So yes, the squaring according to him. So he gives us a formula for squaring. Squaring is finding how does he call it? It's basically finding the half of the two sides multiplied together, right? There's ways of doing it. It's not simple how to do it, but that's what it would be, right? So if you have, for example, if you have a rectangle which has a length and a width, right? So you just add those together and then cut them in half, and the half would be the one side of the square, right? Then you know how the square would be, right? That makes sense. It's just hard to do it because if you just do a divide by 2, you don't always get to a whole number, so you get stuck. So you have to find ways of doing it. But it's basically a very simple thing to do. So in other words, he says, if I tell you the definition of squaring is finding the middle term, literally the middle term, like the middle, the mean, how's he call it? Finding the discovery of the mean proportional, whatever. Basically, the half of the length of both sides together. That's what squaring is. Now, both have good definitions. It's interesting. Both seem to be good answers to the question, what is squaring? What is squaring? Squaring is getting the area of the square that's equal to the not square, right? Or not equilateral, really. Both are squares. What is squaring? I can tell you another answer. What is squaring is doing this procedure of finding the mean length, right? That's also what squaring is, right? The difference is that the second one actually told me how it happens. or what the cause of the squaring is. It's not the cause like metaphysically, because the cause is just that it's the same, so it doesn't really have a cause. Although he might think that geometry like has some kind of cause in some way, but it's not a cause. It's the cause of me finding the square, right? But that's a much better, and it's not missing really anything, right? I still know that the end result would still be the first definition. Maybe I still need that, because I ask you, why am I doing this? He'll tell me the end, right? Or another way of saying it, like, what's the form? What's the point of all of this? What's the structure organizing all of this? It's for us to find the square area that's equal to the rectangle area.
Final cause and
yeah, so this is the efficient cause, basically.
Efficient cause, right.
The final or the formal cause, which are almost the same, would be what I just said, the general definition. And that's why another way of saying, now you realize why another way of saying the difference between the definition we had until now and the one we're looking for is that we have the formal cause. But that's not very helpful always.
Explanatory result.
It doesn't give us the efficient cause, or the moving cause, which is language. It doesn't give us the moving cause. It doesn't tell you how we got from A to B. And the how would be like an example of squaring, the finding the mean term. Or the how in the soul would be finding some kind of specific version of the soul, really. I tell you the soul is the activity. Okay, what is that activity? If I would tell you what that activity is, now you would know what the soul is in a more specific way. Or the truth is that this is also a different form. That's why it's a little. I don't entirely want to say that it's just the formal cause versus the efficient cause, but it's almost that. Yeah, and he says it like that, so so it's true. Yeah. So these are 4 things that we're missing, and you'll see that they're almost the same thing now. Or 5 things, we could say. We're also missing the efficient cause. These are 5 different ways of saying the kasha or the baya. Okay. So in order to answer this question, what we need to do is sort of start, and this is another side. We have to start from the bottom up, right? The previous definition that we gave ourselves, we started from the top down, which was we started from everything. Everything is a substance or not a substance, and then we sort of by what's called a division, at least in Plato, by sort of denying the other side of each dilemma, we got to where we got to what the soul is. It can't be this, it can't be this, it must be in this box. That's the way we get, that's one way of getting at very general definitions, which are not extremely helpful, or not showing us the cause. The way to show us the cause would be to go backwards, and going backwards is actually a much more logical way. It's not a logical way, right? Remember the difference between things closer to themselves and things closer to us, right? The truth is that the world is first just everything, and then substance, and then all those things. But we don't learn that way. We learn bottom up, right? We learn from looking at things. Another way of saying it, we don't really learn from causes to effects. We learn from effects to causes, right? We learn things backwards. So instead of doing the top-down thing, where the cause of, he really would say the cause of the soul being like this is because there is because it's a activity of or actuality of a living body and so on. But that's a very general thing. So the way to do it better, to show us the cause, really, would be to work from the effect. Look, let's have a better look at what is this thing that we're calling life, and how it works. How is a living thing alive, or what causes it to be alive? And then that would give us the soul as that, and that would give us the specific soul. And then we know the specific soul. We can start asking the question that we wanted to ask, which is, does it separate, and are there a few souls, and so on? Okay. So what he does is, he basically says something like this, and I'm not going to go through all of them right now. Maybe, I don't think he even does. But he says that, and if you go in line in the second paragraph over here, okay? I could read even what it says, because it says just what I said. So now let's go back to the beginning of our inquiry. We go back to the beginning. In other words, the beginning to the bottom of it, which is another beginning, as he explained here. It's a way to start. We say soul is different from not soul by that having life, right? But life is spoken of in many ways. One of Aristotle's famous best slogans. Things are spoken of in many ways. Life means more than one thing. So one reason we say that something is alive is, well, he gives 4 different things that we say, okay? And then it's going to go from them, talk about them from the bottom, sort of, okay? Intellect, life is something that thinks or that intellects, okay? Perception, it senses. Movement, it moves, and a movement that rests in a respective place, it moves in place, called locomotion, right? It moves locally, it moves in space. And a 5th thing would be, I'm up to 3 things, and the 4th thing would be the movement involved in nutrition, and both creative. So that's a different kind of movement, because it's not moving from one place to another, but moving in the sense of growing and decaying, which is involved in nutrition, okay? Now, let's go back to the bottom. So this was like the sort of organizing it in the top-down order. But if we go back to the bottom, we could say, when we say plants are alive, what we're talking about is that they grow and decay, right? And what we mean by that, and to be very clear, is they don't have it they don't have this kind of movement called growth and decay. And they don't have it in the way natural things have movement, right? That's why we make a difference between natural things and ensouled things or living things, which is another word.
Sorry, plants?
Okay, plants have movement. What kind of movement? Not movement in place, but movement in this kind of movement called growing and decaying. Okay?
So they're missing one of the...
They're missing. Plants are not only missing, they have only one. That's where we're going to get at after the whole drusha. But plants, we just start saying, we want to know what this thing soul is. Like, give me the cause. What is it that lives in the living thing, right? What's the cause of living? He says, okay, so let's start. First, we have living being a bunch of things. So now the minimum thing of living, or the one thing of living, is this plants. And plants, we say that they're alive. Let's be clear why it's alive and not more or not less than alive, right? We say that they're alive because they have decay and growth. Now, this is a kind of movement, right? Remember, it's a natural thing. It's a kind of movement that starts from self. But besides for that, it's not a natural movement, because, and he gives this explanation, and he used this in previous book to Fregop, how do you say? To Fregop, the other guy that said that there's no souls, that souls are just living things moving, because he says that natural things don't move in the way of growing and decaying. Very important, right? He said this. Someone said, like Democritus or some guy said, well, the soul is just fire, in other words, the element, which is natural element, and fire always goes up, that's why things grow. And Aristotle says, no, you're totally wrong. Things don't grow by going up. He said, even though plants grow by going up, they're really growing down. He has this shikol toirev, because the root of the plant is the top of it, because it's like the head of an animal, and the plants are the plant of the bottom of it. So plants are not even growing up, they're growing down, if you think about it, because down and up are not just, for each thing have their own definition. So that's one thing he says. But more importantly, they don't grow up. They grow by a certain plan. They grow up to the side and to the right and to the left. So they grow by a certain plan. In other words, they have, in the most basic terms that I can say in like regular our English, they have a level of organization that natural things don't have, of a level of plan or a level of movement. Right? They do something that racks don't do. Racks fall. They do something according to him, but they don't do anything that complicated. Now this is what we call a soul. Now, that's why it's not just a natural thing, it's a living thing, but it doesn't do more than that. Now we ask you, why does it do that? Right? We're looking for the cause. Why does it do that? So Aristotle says, I know why it does that. And this is important, I'm saying from the seat, this is whatever, go if weiß nicht. He says, I know why it's doing it. Otherwise, I know what the soul is. I don't just telling a story. Why? Because I can see it eating. Very important. Because it's eating. In other words, it doesn't just grow, right? Plants just grow, for example. They don't have a soul. Rocks just grow, and they don't just grow, they just go up and down, okay? Or just go down, really. There's this guy, Themistius, in his commentary, has a whole discussion that maybe some people say that rocks do grow, and what do we do with this problem? Okay. But Aristotle says that rocks don't grow. What do I want to say? About why do they grow? Or what is the grower, right? What is the thing that causes them to grow? What's the mover? What's the efficient cause of the growing? It says it's eating, right? Well, it's not eating. Eating is not, but this nutrition. Nutrition, in other words, nutrition is a word, we keep on saying this word, nutritive soul. Now you give a definition for it. Nutritive soul is this causality that exists between eating and growing. Okay? In other words, we can see that it doesn't just grow, it grows by eating. So this is not like him just saying, well, it grows because it has a soul. So people say, well, he just said magic. No, because to him, soul just, and that would be the form. That is the act. This growing by eating, if you want to define it, would be what we said yesterday, what we said in Perek Aleph, which is the activity of the thing, because it has that kind of organization and that kind of form. But the growing by eating, now I give you a much better, a much clearer, a much more useful definition. It's nutritive in the sense that it grows by eating. That's what nutritive means, grows by eating. And how do we see this? This is not just philosophers made up metaphysical magic. Actually, it's basically science. We observed it. We can see that when it eats, it grows, and when it doesn't eat, it doesn't grow. So that's seeing the activity of the soul. That's what we mean when we say that's the aliveness of a plant is, well, plants eat, for whatever they take in, and they grow by that. So the growing by that, which plants do, is what we mean by form of life called plant soul or nutritive soul. Okay, so now you have a better definition, and he would go on to give the same kind of definition for the animal soul and so on. And we'll see, but at least you have a good example of the kind of definition he is looking for here. And this would be obviously a specific definition, right? Specific in the sense that it only explains it is a different one in some way. Well, we'll have to see in what way it's different. But there's a different one for the nutritive soul than for if we go higher than that, right? If we go up.
That this thing is outside of the plant, what the plant is.
It's not outside of the plant, it's inside the plant.
No,
Why would it be
I'm saying
outside?
the food.
Yeah, the food is not the plant itself. That's
is
what.
that a critical point? Like the fact that it's taking something outside of itself and using it to grow?
Well, you have to figure out later, and when he actually explains nutrition, and like chapter 4, 5, 6, whatever, to explain how it really works. But the point is just, no, I don't think it matters. If it would happen by itself, it eats itself, whatever. I don't think, I don't know. Right now, I don't know. He has a whole TED of how nutrition is supposed to work. But I don't think that's the point.
So
I think the point is...
explain it to us in a way that's observable if it happens internally to itself. The body can be... We could call all sorts of processes within the body eating, because it might even replicate it.
Which ones? Within racks, for example?
I'm saying is... Eating, we typically understand as something going from outside the thing to inside
But that's not the point. The point is that I can see a kind of causality. I can see a sort of system or some sort of principle or some sort of organization working here. You eat and then you grow. And then...
Why is it better than just grow?
Because it doesn't just grow. Just growing is just doesn't give you why. What causes it?
Because
everything has a
cause.
The
rest of the world,
we're looking for the cause.
Growth is something that goes from out it and then
that's not. Again, the growth is what it does. This is what needs the explanation, right? Now, what is the explanation? The explanation is it eats, right?
Eating is just another form of life.
No.
Why not?
Because we see this connection between things. Eating in the broader sense, right? Eating and taking in whatever nutrition.
Why does it eat?
It eats in order to grow, right? It doesn't just eat for no reason. If you eat for no reason, only humans do that. Whatever, that's a crazy thing. That's obesity. That's because of McDonald's, whatever. What?
It doesn't take an organization itself to eat.
The organization, exactly, but it's connected very well with the growing, with the kind, yeah. It's you eat in order to grow. We see these two things, they're one thing. They're the soul. They're the nutritive soul. Eating plus growing is the nutritive soul. Not eating plus growing, eating causing to grow. That's a kind of form, of course. This whole system, so to speak, is a form, right? It's not a body. It needs a certain kind of body and it needs a certain kind of form. And that's what we call the nutritive soul. It's not separable from the matter and so on, like we discussed, but that's the nutritive soul. Eating is, of course, a kind of organization. If you want to sort of divide it and first eating and then growing, that's fine. But that's not what we're looking for. We're looking to explain the growing, which is what we call living. Of course, that part of that living is the eating. It's part of it, and that's the partness of it. In other words, the relation is exactly what this kind of form, this like thing that we call the nutritive soul. What I was saying, this is a specific definition because this definition would be different for a thing that eats or for a thing that thinks, right? Thinking is a kind of activity. It's another thing that souls do, and they do it in a certain way. Or sensing is perceiving is a kind of thing that we do in a certain way, but they don't do it by eating, right? And we could think of how much it's specific, but it's a different account. In other words, this story that gives us the efficient cause of the soul gives us a different story for a plant soul as it does for an animal soul. And we can start figuring out how different they are and what they're different, but they're different. It's not like the previous definition that we said that it's just the same for everything.
To explain the cause by explaining the system.
We explain the effect by explaining the cause. And this cause-effect system is the nutritive soul. The growing by, this is a level of organization, right? The most basic word for form is a kind of organization. It doesn't just grow, it grows by eating. Nothing just happens anyway. Everything has a moving cause. Rocks also have a moving cause, which is their nature. Just that their nature, like we said, isn't that complicated. It doesn't grow. It does things more simple than that, which is why they don't have a soul. Okay, this is the important thing. Now, what did I get with this? Okay, so now you can understand why we at least have some basis on which to think of our very important question, which is, in what way, or does the soul have parts, or in what way is the soul homogeneous? In other words, in what way is animal souls the same as human souls and not the same? In other words, what does this Rambam mean when he starts his book and saying that nefesh odam achas? In what way is a soul one, and so on? What does all these things mean? So, the first thing he says, and what we have to get at now, and I'm jumping out of the book a little bit because he doesn't do this, is we need a sort of a list of different ways of being separable, different ways of being divisible. Okay, this is another thing that's said in many ways. It doesn't give it this account right here, but if you think about it, you know that's what's going on. There's a whole bunch of ways of being separate, or in other words, of being divisible. So the first way, and the most basic way, let's be very clear, the most basic way, and we discussed this last week, I think, right? The most basic way for when we say that things are different. By the way, I saw in Zohar today, it says, And the Mefarshim said that I didn't make up this pshat. I keep on telling you that Olam HaNefradim, nobody learns Zohar. In Kabbalah we have language Alma de Perid, the Olam HaNefradim, and most people take it, maybe in Tikkun Zohar it's like this, take it as a bad thing. So there's like Olam HaAchdas, which is one, and this separate world, which is separate. But that's totally a mistake. In other words, it might be true that relative to a higher oneness, these are separate, but the main meaning of it is actually separate in this sense. So if there's like a non-physical part which is separate from physical, that's what used to be called separate intellects, right? Or separate things. And there's says a Fetish in this week in Parshas Boy, I forgot, I don't have it here, it was on the table earlier. Someone took it away. It said there, this is why, and it says in Aramaic, it says this is why the angels or whatever are called Prishan. So, and Purish means like a Purish, separate. It's translating the word nifrad, or separate, from the philosophers. And so it's the same, they're using the same terminology. Anyways, so the main thing that we mean by separability is capable of independent existence, right? Right? If I, right, again, the unseparable things, right, would be, and the main example, and the most prime example that Aristotle actually himself uses in this chapter, is the difference between eternal things and non-eternal things, right? God is the most separate thing in the world because not, for example, or even the gods, if you think certain other things, right? God is the most separable thing because he doesn't need anything else to exist. Okay, he's separate from all the things that he creates. They're not separable from him, but he's separable from them. So now you see that something can be separable in one way only. Very important also, right? You could be needed. You could be contingent on something, and that thing not contingent on you, or you can be both ways contingent, and so on. But the point is, separable just means not contingent to the other thing that to the thing that we're separating it from, right? That's why the main discussion of the soul began with saying, is the soul separate, right? Can the soul exist without the body? Which is another way of saying, is the soul immortal? Right? As Plato tried to prove in many ways that the soul could exist without the body. Unlike what our Chachamim thought, so don't think that this is as to a minute. They thought that the soul can't really exist without the body. Okay, that's why we need to get some medicine, right? Or at least can't fully exist, right? So Judaism traditionally was very not Platonist, and when the Rambam tried to make it Platonist, he was very attacked. So don't make a mistake of thinking that we need a separate soul for religion. It's sort of the opposite. Religions hate the idea of separate souls. It's a philosophical idea. Okay. And they don't hate it, but they're not traditionally based on it. Although it's more complicated than that, but at least in this way, yes. Okay, the point is that that's the first meaning of separable, okay? So now we can ask, for example, if we have this specific, now these like sort of two questions, right? We have to remember there's two questions of the separability of the soul. There's one question, if the soul itself can be cut up into different parts, like Plato said, right? That we have the intellectual soul being one part and the nutritive soul, well, he didn't call it this way. He didn't have these words. And the reason he didn't have these words is because he had these words that doesn't really work. But he said that there are different parts of the soul, or different souls, and one wants, right, one is the Yitzchok, one is the Yitzchok, and so on. Or not. Then a similar question, or almost the same question, if you think about it in the way Aristotle thinks about it, is the soul separable from the body, right? And he already answers that the soul is not separable from the body because that question doesn't make sense. It's like asking if the whole is separable from the donut, right? At least in the sense, if part of the soul, or if one soul is the actuality of the body. And the way he got out of this, what he always says is, if there is a part of the soul which is not an actuality of a body, then it's separable, right? Nous intellect might not be part of actuality of any body. Now, so that's what separate existence means, or separability is, right? So now, if we ask the internal question, right? Is the nutritive soul separable from the animal soul, right? We could talk about this, right? Now we have nutritive, right? We say, by the way, the same thing for animals, right? Animals, he doesn't give a full account of this right now. He says, for example, right? He tries a little bit because he needs to do something else, which I'm not going to be able to get to now. But he talks about and let's take so nutritive soul is the thing that grows by eating. Then we have a sensitive soul, right? Sensitive soul is, or let's say moving soul, it moves by moving, I don't know, by the mover, just like in the same way. He doesn't give an answer here to that question. What's the mover? The nutritive soul, or we talk about sensing soul. Senses soul senses by sense perception, okay? So there's something, in the same way that there's some cause and effect that connects the soul, the nutritive soul from eating to growing. There's something that connects it from somehow perceiving to perceiving, right? Which is two things. If you realize that it's very similar.
The thing prior, just
Same way.
If for the soul to be immortal, it would have to not be associated with the body.
Yeah, we read this a bunch of times.
Else, right?
Yes, would have to be the form of not a part of the body. Yes. Yes, or a form or actuality of not of the body, or of not of
And that thing wouldn't either be contingent on the body, I guess. The soul wouldn't be.
There would be no such thing. That would just be the soul. Yeah, it would be the same thing as that thing. So
how wouldn't that be a separate form then?
It would be separate from this one, which is the body, which is the activity of the body.
So the soul being the form of the body and the same soul being the form of the intellect would be what?
The question is if it would be the same one. No, he doesn't want it to be the same one. The opposite is he thinks that if it would be the same one, there would be a problem.
Why is
it has to be a different one.
Then?
It has to be a different one. Okay, so what does it mean to have two or one? We're going to get to that. Because it's not a different one.
That if the soul outlives the body, it's a separate soul, not this one. If there's
I just said that's what separate means. That's just what it means. That's the Perish HaMilah. Separate means can't exist without.
Right. Okay.
Okay. If something is just the form of the body, then it cannot exist. It cannot exist without.
It would have to be the form of.
Form of nothing exists without that thing. No such a thing.
Right. Of course not. But I'm saying is then what is it?
It could be that the form. We have to get to this in a long time if we figure out the relation with these two things, the actual relation between intellect and everything else. But it could be that the form. So, for example, this is let's get to this. We have to, and let me try to answer two questions, but we're going to do it on a lower level, not with the intellect, because it gets us complicated for reasons like this. But we have to ask a more different question. Let's ask it at the basic level. Two things that are forms of bodies, if they're the same one. Okay, is the form of the body in the sense of the nutritive soul? Is it the same thing? Is it separable? Is it the same thing? Well, in what way is it the same, and what way is it different from the thing that causes you to sense? That's what I'm up to right now. I'm not up to the intellect, because it gets us into bigger issues. But is it the same? Forget about being forever, being eternal. We'll get to this right now. But in other words, could there exist a nutritive soul without a sensitive soul, or a sensitive soul without a nutritive soul?
Can I ask this in an inaccurate way, but just to understand that if we have an animal that for some reason lacked senses, would it have the same vegetable soul?
Exactly, the other way around is really,
Or if a vegetable somehow perceived,
yes,
it would be an animal soul.
Yes. Could there be an animal that has only a vegetable or something? Exactly. Could we divide this?
It's not a separate thing that makes all these things happen. It's the same.
Exactly. Is there one? Exactly. Well, or two things. In other words, if an animal is a vegetable plus a cow, are there now two souls or two forms or two things?
It's associated.
Exactly.
Thing.
In other words, are they separable? Well, that's what I'm saying. We have to figure out what this word two things is, because there's going to be like 4 or 5 or 6 different meanings for this thing. But that's the question that he's getting at. I just jumped because I think that the same question, and we need to answer the same question in order to answer the question of the immortal human soul. The thing that we have to figure out is if these are different. Now, he said, now let's answer the question very simply. We have, at least in one direction, it's very easy to answer it. So he says this. In one direction, it's very easy to answer it, right? Is the nutritive soul separate from the sensitive soul? Well, there's grass. Grass have only nutritive soul. They don't have any other soul. So obviously, nutritive soul can exist without any higher soul, so to speak. So in that way, it's separable. So in this one way, at least one way, it's for sure separable. And this is why, that's very clear, because we're not going to be clear enough today, because I'm doing too many things at once. But this is why Aristotle thinks that there's different forms of life, okay? If you've heard of them in Samech HaMedaber, which might not be entirely accurate according to this book, but if you heard of different forms of life or different levels of life, they're only different if they're separable, or at least in some way. Then one kind of separable, not all kinds of separable make you different. But at least some kind of separable is what gives us this classification, which makes a difference. Okay, and like I asked last week, if we're just cutting up things by what they do, maybe why wouldn't we make 1,000 kinds of life? Like there's different animals with thousands of different capacities. Why don't we say there's a lot of different kinds of life? Remember, kinds of life is the same thing as kinds of soul. And the reason is because they're not separable. Only if they're separable, at least in this way, one can exist for real, right? It can be a being, an animal, or a plant. That is only that soul. That's what gives us a different soul, or a different kind of animal. And animal, by the way, is another word that just means living thing. So all these things just mean living thing. They're different classes of living things, like different levels of organization, like real different kinds, a very general difference. Mashankin, the fact that one animal has a trunk or jumps and the other one doesn't jump and so on, that's just parts of animal. That's apart in another way, but it's not separable. You can't just jump without having a nutritive soul, for example. That would be the way he sees it. It's almost doing science and biology. It's almost. Now, yes, so that in one way it's true, and then he says, he thinks that, and he doesn't give the reason here. In the end of the book, he tries to give a reason why it must be that way. We discussed this last week, but he thinks that it's only separable in one way. So it's separable. You can have a nutritive soul without a vegetable soul, without a, how do they call it? Without a sensing soul, whatever the higher thing is, because we have to figure out what exactly that is, but for him, it's sensitive. In other words, being able to having the sense, at least the sense of touch, because all the other senses can exist without it and it not without them. So, it can exist without the other senses but not this, so that's what defines the animal, and at least the sense of touch. He says that we call anything that has the sense of touch animal. Okay, animal is something that has a sense of touch. That's how you move from being a vegetable to an animal, by having the sense of touch. Okay, that's what it is. That's the only condition you need, and which means that that's a different kind of life.
So I moved a little fast, and I'm trying.
But you already know this. You already know that the vegetable is different from an animal by sensing, by the animal sensing. Okay. Which sense of touch? But who cares about that right now? Point is, he senses. Now, can there be sensing without nutrition? That's the question. There could be nutrition without sensing. We know that because we found trees, but we never found anything that senses without nutrition. He thinks that he did a bunch of biological research, and he never found something like that. If you did find something like that, let me know. I think he's right, at least for the empirical side of it, this is true. There's nothing that senses without. Well, malachim don't sense. They malachim think, of course. He agrees with that. Malachim don't sense, right? Senses mean something. And there's a difference between sensing and thinking. We'll have to figure out that also. But they don't sense.
Well, they don't have that. They have
their intellects. Well, yeah. We're not talking about malachim today. But yeah, nothing senses. I mean, your phone senses without nutrition, right? That's what people might think, but they don't sense in his terms, for sure not. In any case, because they don't have knowledge, right? Because there's no one to do the sensing, because they don't have a soul, basically, right? So the whole question doesn't begin, because they're not natural objects, because they're artificial, and there's only someone thinking through them, and so on. So the kids say sensors don't actually sense, right? The sensor that tells me if it's raining now or whatever, it doesn't actually sense, right? Because there's no thing that senses. That's what sensing means, according to him at least. You could call it sensor. It's Hashem Meshutif. It's no shaykhs. Point is, so we didn't find anything that senses without growing. If you find something, let me know. He didn't find one. I'm thinking, is there something? So, which shows us that, at least, he says, in mortal things, he gives this, by the way, if you read, where am I up to here? Concerning, where did I start? It says it's openly, your question about Maluchmi answers right here, but it doesn't just talk about them. He says, Meferish, I need to cut it out more to be able to. Here, if you in the bottom of the first page, it says this can exist apart from the others, the nutritive, but the others cannot exist apart from it in mortal creatures. So there might be immortal creatures that can think without growing, but there's no mortal creatures that can do it. At least not the ones that we know. Maybe gods can do it, but gods eat according to, I don't know. Gets it. But that's for sure true. So in other words, and for some reason, and he thinks that there must be a reason for this, so it must be like necessary that it should be this way. But he doesn't tell us over here, and you have to look later, and it's not clear that it says it later. But in any case, it's not discussion now. So it's one way separable, which is enough for us to classify it. It's enough for us to say it's a different kind of life, but not you can't. What's the important implication of this is that in the human, right, in the thing that has these two kinds of life, right, you could be a only sensing or only neutralizing thing, but in the thing that has both,
only
right?
Sensing isn't sensing without intellect, not the other way around. You can't sense without nutrition.
Exactly, you can sense, and you can't also intellect without sensing for humans most.
Right.
Maybe yes, but again, but you can't. All these levels are one way separable, right? Which means that in the higher thing, in the animal that both thinks and senses, there's only one soul. There's no two souls in the animal, right? Because he is the thing. What?
How are you getting to that?
Yes, because since I told you that it's only one way separable. In other words, you cannot sense without growing. Okay, why? I don't know. Let's assume that it somewhat makes sense logically. You cannot sense without growing. So the grower and the sensor is the same one. Right. Another way of showing this would be to say that another way of saying this, if you want to like find like a, and he probably would think that, if you want to find like the material side of this, you would say that in animals that sense, their nutritive faculty must work differently than plants. They have a different. They're very much connected with the. In other words, the nutritive faculty is the nutritive soul is also the one that senses. It's not like there's one that senses and one that's nutritive. It's the nutritive that also senses, right? And you could like find the material side of this and show somehow how the digestive system or whatever in sensitive things has to be more complex and work differently than the one in, because it has to carry on itself the sensing also. So you can't like cut up an animal to these two levels, for example, and say it's a vegetable with a land of animal, because the whole animal is an animal. Animal is entirely animal. There's no vegetable part in it anymore. One analogy.
You can't just take out the sensing.
Exactly. You can't just take it out. An analogy. Exactly. The analogy that Themistius says is that difference in a salad and a kigel. You remember the salad kigel drusha?
No.
He sort of uses this example, almost literally. Well, he doesn't use a salad and a kigel, but a salad and a kigel are very different. Are both made out of two things or more than two things, but they're very different, right? Because a salad is something that, at least theoretically, if you have enough patience, if you have a kid that's very picky, you could pick out all the cucumbers from the tomatoes. So it's mixed out of two things, but it's separable, even after being mixed. Of course, it's something called a salad, but it's the things in it didn't become one. Yeah, but when you make a kigel and you make it with flour and eggs and whatever, you can't actually. Nobody picky enough can take all the flour out of the kigel. Why? Because in other words, there's not really any flour in it. There's maybe only potential flour or something like that. There's no flour in it anymore. It's a whole new thing called a kigel. Okay, that's really how hylomorph in even matter and form can't be separated in the same way, right? That's why the Rambam sometimes says that the lower souls in a human are like matter to the higher soul, which means that they can't actually be separated if you think of it in this way. In other words, it becomes into a kigel. It becomes into a new thing. Yeah, exactly. It becomes into a third thing. It becomes into a new thing. Now, the new thing is true. You could cook that as, so it's made out of, and it's not historically made of, people in my other stats asked if, according to evolution, that maybe animals are made out of plants or whatever. But doesn't change much. That's a question of the history. But after evolution made it, it's still a kigel. You can't take the plant out of the animal, which means that the animal is only one animal. It's the same soul that is both the nutritive soul and the sensing soul in an animal.
Which means that its nutritive soul is different than the
exactly. It's an animal nutritive soul, or we could now. That's
nutritive
one
soul of sensing.
Very important. Now we're left. What? Yeah, probably the matter has also a different. But for sure, the concept is different, and which means, but we're left with a different kind of difference, right? Just to be very clear, and we discussed this. We're left with a conceptual difference. That's what we call powers of soul or faculties of soul. That's why there's a big difference in saying powers of soul and saying souls, right? Because we're left with a big difference where, of course, we could discuss the system or the power of growing separately from this sense of sensing. You might even be sick where your problem is, and there might even be a different doctor for each or a different science for each, right? That doesn't mean that the thing that the doctor is treating is different from the thing that the psychologist is treating, right? It's the same thing, although they're different sciences. They're conceptually distinct, but not actually distinct, right? So we're always going to be left with conceptual distinction over here, or what he calls separable in thought, but not in the thing. The thing that we're thinking about is one thing, like matter and form, or like a lot of things that are separable in thought, but not what I told you. It's called bebchinat, according to in the Hebrew, or bechina.
What he calls koiches, so the Rambam calls koiches.
The Rambam calls this power. Yeah, the Rambam says that the correct way of saying it is the powers. The Aristotle also use the word power, and so he says sometimes we call these powers parts, but that's not speaking accurately. Or in other words, it's accurately because parts has all these meanings. Okay.
In different contexts.
Yeah. Another thing that I have to talk about, and I have to figure this out exactly, and I don't entirely know what he wants from this, but Aristotle very much, let's talk about it. This is like three kinds of separability that is discussed, right? There's like separate entire, two-way separability, which souls don't have. There's one-way separability, which they do have, right? And then there's conceptual separability, which they also do have, okay? There's another thing which is called separability in space, right? In other words,
but the fact that we can separate the lower faculties from the higher one is also...
We can't. We can only separate...
It's only conceptual.
Exactly. In a thing, in an animal that has more than one faculty, we can only conceptually separate it. We can't act... You can't take... There's no way... Another way of saying this would be that, according to him, well, people say this actually, according to him, like when we call a human a vegetable, it's not even a vegetable. You got it?
Why not?
If you take a human, for example, if you take a human and take away his intellect, he's not a human anymore, and he's not even an animal. He's not even an animal. Well, this is true. For example, again, you might put him in an ICU, which means that he's part of a different human. Take a human. For example, animals are good at being animals, right? That has to do with your question of perfection. Animals are good at being animals, right? In other words, they can survive just by using all the koiches that animals have. Okay, an animal's hungry, he goes to the water and he eats a zebra or whatever. Okay, humans can't eat zebras. They only eat by intellect. This is true for humans. Humans need at least some kind of intellect, or some level of human knowledge in order to survive. You can't survive as an animal. Exactly. It's somewhat. In some sense, your animal part is weaker than I don't know animals, right? The whole point, the reason why this Homo sapiens became the apex predator was because his intellect was stronger. Well, some people could say because he has endured something. Okay, that's a different shit. But according to the Namala shit, it's because he uses a cycle. Okay. And using a cycle. In other words, human is not an animal plus because there's no way to reduce a human to only animal, right? Or if you put, according to this, if you put a guy, the people they're not afraid of saying it. Like if you're right, like Aristotle says, and those people, a dead body is not even a human body; it's something else, right? Because the human body is only a live human body. Dead body is a different kasha. How did it stay a form and so on? There's only shit as Aristotle. If you're Platonist or whatever, then you don't have this. And the same way. Exactly, they're not separable. You can't. They're not three. You don't have three souls. You only have a human soul, and your eating is also a human soul eating. And you cannot. Which means one way of showing this, again, this would be like the material side of it, is to show that humans cannot eat without using their minds, and the same way animals cannot eat without using their senses. Although plants do. Plants eat very well without sensing anything. They're sort of in the dark, like so to speak, and they survive very nicely. But animals can't do that. Animals need their senses. That's what their senses do. So in some sense, the higher you are, the less like robust you are, because you need your higher parts to do the same thing. Or the same thing, they would say a person that lost his mind is not a human anymore. Really not. He's something that used to be a human. Like you could like really ask questions about this, or a potential human. But if you're never going to be a human anymore, that's why Treif. But I look things like this. Remember,
they could survive with someone else's intellect. That's what they could do.
With someone?
You can survive.
Yeah, but let's say you lose your mind. If you have some kind of unreversible dementia, then you're not human anymore.
See, you only survive.
You're allowed to be dead, killed, and that's the halacha. Because if you kill a Treif, even you're not chayv. Well, you're not like mitzvah.
Those people only survive with someone else.
Treifa, Heirik Treifa is better.
Yeah, I know, but why? It's not the same thing.
Well, someone without a mind definitely can't exist. He only exists. That's Anach Treifa Gedolim Mizeh. He can only exist because his Meshuris over there is feeding him. That's not called being alive.
He doesn't go down to eating like a plant. He has to be kept
exactly.
alive by other
exactly. You don't go back to being a plant. Human vegetables are worse than vegetables. The vegetables in the Nebuch, but the vegetable is worse than a vegetable. He's not even a vegetable. What is he? Some new kind of thing. I'm not saying that you should kill him or whatever. I'm just saying that it's not even a human. That's why, for example, I was worried about this. I told you that I didn't tell you. Like people seem to be worried. Like if you, for example, nowadays many people die without their minds. Okay, like we have all these tzaddik gedolim and whatever, and like their see power is when they're not, and then when their mind doesn't work, and people. No, people are weird. People have this like progressive view of humanity. Like we have to steig always. So, and since you steig until you lose your mind, it seems like that's the highest madrega. It's the highest madrega politically. I mean, it should match. And then like worried. Well, the Rambam or Aristotle says that you're only human basically with your mind, and that goes to Al-Mahaba. And what do you mean? Like, so the tzaddik that doesn't have his mind, what's the point of the whole thing? And Aquinas asked this question, or something like this question, in his commentary on this book. And the Anamai says, "Well, you just got it wrong. He died a long time ago. Now there's something else existing, which is a whole new Beri Chadasha called the Gabba's sign. But the Rebbe is dead, because human means to have your mind. Now he says, like he asked this question. So what do we do with smart people that lose their mind or nebuch? The same kasha as Iev. Man, why do bad things happen? Sometimes people die. Some people die younger than others. So this guy died. The fact that he's still walking around doesn't mean he's not dead. Because we defined life by this, so it's not worried.
You argue the Kamayesi Kabashuk at the
Yeah, the Shivralichas is because the soul, the matter is also epis, but it's a Zaycha, but Lamas is nicht you can't ask him Shilas, right? Man. Shivralichas from Lechem Boren, it's very nice, a covet, but also Shivralichas might work with not this opinion of mind, but that's another Shal.
Guess more Shal, then you get the answer you want.
Exactly. Then you're talking not that person alive, someone else. But yeah, Nachamol. We also bury dead people, although we respect their bodies because it's like how do you say? It's like the body that used to have a human in it. So it's uchtepes. It's like mekadeshos naf b'shem shemayim. But that also usually the people that like that are not Aristotelians and they think that there is a soul in it. So that's another discussion. Gets it. What did I say? The point is that a human, this is why it's very important. A human cannot be, a higher thing cannot be. So it's separable in one way only, and you can't actually. That's why it's, according to this way of thinking, it's very incorrect to say that a human has three souls. A human has one human soul who does three things and sort of like takes over in a very complete way all the things that the other souls do, right? Because it entirely takes it over, and then now they can't be anything else. And both physically and in all kinds of ways, and definitionally, like it's that. Yeah, and that's why the nafkamina is that a human is not also can't morally be an animal and say, well, at least I'll be a good animal. You can't at least be a good animal, like have a big fat body that kicks. That's not very helpful for the moral perfection of a human, right? Because you're totally not a human. You're not like half a human. You're just not zero. What did I say? That's what I say. Okay. Now I have to talk about one more thing. I'm going to finish with this. Now, Aristotle seems to be worried, and it seems to also go against Plato, because Plato had this thing, and I don't know what he even meant, because he probably didn't mean it in the silly way that he's attacking. But that's what we do when we learn one shitta. That's what happens. We buy their straw man of other shittas. And Plato said famously, and I told you the Mekabbalim like this, that there's three souls that he had, which are not the same. By the way, they're not the same as there's still in three souls. Because if you think of there's still in three souls, the definitions they got, the reason why they're these three souls is because he thinks in this whole way. And Plato's three souls are officially the intellect. That's that one they both agree on, and not only that, Aristotle sort of has a Platonic intellect. So, but the other two are anger and passion. Okay, that's what it says in the Republic. So do with that what you want. Okay, the middle soul is called anger, and the lower soul is called passion. Anger and not passion. Passion is also a word for anger. The lower one is called appetitive. So tava. The word tava we have. And Rav Sadigan quotes this shit, and it says tava kas sechel.
What was it?
Tava kas sechel. This is Plato's language.
Sounds Freudian.
Yeah. Freud is a Platonist, of course. Of course, very Platonist. Of course, but and that's what there's a whole. Like I'm not getting into that, but of course, Freud definitely thinks of as separate and things that are even in conflict with one another that Aristotle can't accept. So they're different. So they're not. People often associate, since Aristotle also has a human being having these three powers, so they're like sort of the same thing, but they're totally not the same thing.
Because put like the plants.
And you might be able to make this kind of shidduch.
Aristotle's dependent.
Exactly. Right? You might be able to make the shidduch, but they're working with totally different definitions of everything. So it's not. I'm just showing you how far it is by using the original words. I'm not saying you can make it closer. But that Plato said that each of these belong to a different part of the body, right? So famously, your head is where your intellect is, and your heart is where your anger is or passion is, and your liver is where your appetite is. Okay, and it sort of makes sense if you think of like these three systems, where like liver is sort of like has to do with the eating system, which makes you want to eat, and so on. And heart is where people locate their emotions, which is sort of what we mean when we say anger and passion.
We call stomach.
And the brain is where people locate their thoughts. Although I don't know how true that is, but that's sort of how it makes sense. What?
We use stomach now instead of liver, but people use the same terms, right? Like my stomach wants it, but my head.
No, stomach would be even lower than that. Like it doesn't even want. It's like sort of most passive. Your stomach only wants. Okay, I don't know. I'm not giving you that shit because I don't know right now. But that's how Plato said in his Republic, and other places he said different things. But that's what it says in at least one version, and you get this exact version in many Jewish books when Mayach left COVID, and they have all kinds of Torahs and Ramuzim and stuff.
The kidneys don't play a different.
What?
The kidneys are not part of this.
Kidneys are kloyas.
Yeah, the kloyas.
I don't know. Those also have to do with the blood cycle. I don't know. That's Chazal. I don't know if they meant that literally or what they even thought. I don't know. The kidneys also do things. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer. Maybe he talks about it. What's his name? The chicken without a head person. Okay, the kid said. There's a book here called Chicken Without a Heart. Sorry.
That was
He
the
talks
thing
about
with
these kind of
Diogenes. He
discussions.
brought a
Yeah, that was it. That was different. Okay, so
I can't see you.
yeah, it has to do with this whole thing. Okay, it's it. And what did I get to? Oh, so now Aristotle is trying to talk about if we could separate it in space. In other words, let's talk about seems to be talking also about Plato's theory, where it seems like you'd be able to cut off someone's head, and being only with appetite and passion, or vice versa. Like maybe if you would cut off your lower body or whatever, you'll be only smart or something like that.
Well, why did it cut off the head? The head itself could be also.
Well, it can't live, but that's for different reasons. It might be like for random reasons, but at least ideally, at least conceptually, or at least conceptually is not a good word.
Ideally, you left it 3 always, no matter what you do.
That's what Aristotle says, but I'm trying to say that there's another kind of separability, which would be that you could cut something up in space, just like you take a table and you end up with 2 halves of the table.
Right.
You might be able to take a soul and end up with 2 halves of the soul, right? With these 2 parts, and that's why you might even. This is more important because you might even say like one. Of course, you can't really do it with a living body, but you might be able to do it with a dead body, right? Because Platonists or people like that would say things like your one soul is in your grave and the other one is in Gan Eden or something like that. So it means they can be in different locations. So we could cut up the soul in a very basic way, in the most basic way of cutting up that you would think in Chayde, like you can cut up in different locations. Now Aristotle has a very interesting argument against this, and he has this a few times. This is only one time, and he did an experiment. It's this very weird answer. He said this is not possible. Why? And I don't know what he wants. He'll tell me. I'm a little confused about what he wants with this raya. But this is his raya. His raya is that he took a worm and he cut it up. And some worms, famously, if you cut them up, they go on doing worm things. And he says if you cut up a worm, it doesn't turn into half worm and half worm. It turns into 2 worms. Both of them go on living and doing whatever worms do, or some grass or trees also can be cut up and they both continue living. So there's a whole soul in each half, not a half soul. So if there would be a soul, it'd be sort of like somewhere in the body in a spatially separated way, you would expect a half a worm to do only half of the things that worms do. And he says he agrees that it's true, because usually when you cut it up, it doesn't live for very long. But that's like for a technical reason, because let's say its stomach is over there and its thing is over there, so it doesn't have all the organs that it needs to continue living, but it goes on living. Whatever the things that, in other words, sensing, both of them go on sensing. That's the important thing. And according to him, an animal's entire body senses. In other words, an animal's entire body is an animal, because that's the minimum you need to be an animal. And if you cut it up, most animals die when you cut them up. Some animals don't die when you cut them up. And both of them go on sensing. Same way, if you cut up a tree, both sides of the tree go on neutralizing. So it can't be that the soul is in any way spatially distributed, because then you would expect there to be less soul in each half. But there's not less soul, there's an entire soul in each half.
And losing an arm or something like that, like same type of thing that you don't like, nothing changes, you just that arm?
That was that show.
What?
What does that show when you cut it?
You should lose certain functions of the soul and everywhere else.
Well, maybe there's no important functions in the arm, I don't know. Maybe you do. I mean, you stop being able to use your arm, which is for him a part of the soul. Like, it's sort of the opposite. Like, you do lose some. I don't know. He's very excited about this experiment that he did with cutting up worms. I don't know. I don't know what the point of it is exactly.
It's like me, I'm just fascinated.
No, but what he's trying to get at is that the entire body of an animal is organized by its soul. In other words, this is very much connected with his way of wanting to see the soul as just the form of the body. So it's the form of the entire body, and the entire body of an animal is sensitive, and not the entire one has all organs, not the entire one does everything. But he would say something similar for the thinking human. The entire body thinks. He doesn't think your brain thinks. He doesn't think your brain does anything, Aristotle. But he does think there's a ruling faculty, which is the heart. But it does not what thinks. It's not your heart think for you. A human is a thinking animal, which means that in some ways, like I said, you need thinking for everything to work. So everything thinks. You're organized by thinking. The principle of organizing humans is the thinking soul. And it's not in any specific place. It's in the entire body. It's the organization of the entire body. And if theoretically you would be able to cut up a human and have it going on living, it would still be in other words, it would be 2 souls, 2 full souls, not 2 half souls. So that's another kind of weird thing. And he says, yes, so in this way...
It's the scheme and not the place.
Exactly, it doesn't belong to it's not the place. It's not like a thing. This is getting back at different people that said, like, maybe the soul is just like one more piece, like some other old philosopher said, well, the soul is like the pneuma, the ear in you. And he would say, then you would expect taking out the ear makes you die, but for other reasons. But the soul is not a a little one part of the body. It's in the whole body. And some he said, well, he calls this. Right? He says it might be, but he calls it potentially. In that sense, it's potentially. It's not of. It's the. It's of, if anything.
Right. It can be of.
It's potentially separable. In other words, you could make one worm into two worms, or one tree into two trees. So in that sense, it might not be one. So it's not like limited to be numerically one. It might be able to be numerically two, but it's still one. It's the same one, right? And you could make it into two just by cutting it up, but it can be the same two full souls, which is interesting. Yeah, it would be two ones and not two halves. That's another thing that he's very interested in. And again, it connects to what I was saying before, that you can't take a human and make him into a vegetable by cutting off his vegetable part or wherever that would be. Like imagining Plato, like Plato would imagine that you could put them in different places. You can't do that. That's not how it works. It's all of it is everywhere. This is very important for him. All of it is everywhere, but it's just of it. It's just the form of it. So now I'm just going to tell you one Yiddish Zach. So the Ramban, Heilige Ramban in his Perish on Parshas Bereishis. Weirdly, this is on page 2 of my pages. I'm not going to talk about this at length because I'm going to finish. I'm just going to give you. It starts on page 1 and it goes to page 2, but it's not separable. It's only separable. It's the same shtickle Torah, but it's in 2 different pages. Anyways, and he for some reason decides that he has to discuss this machlokes. He read it in Shemona Prakim, I think, maybe in other places. I don't know if he read Shemona Prakim, did he? He said that the mischak mevamechka, which is somewhat a derogatory term, have a machlokes if a person has one soul or 3 souls. Okay, some people say, and he doesn't have the version where Aristotle with the 3 souls is 3 Aristotelian souls. Okay, and others say that it's 1. Okay.
Where does he start this?
On the top of page 2. On the top of page 2. After him giving you the story that the soul is from God and whatever, from Spheres, he says that this soul, and he sort of thinks that both could work with his theories. This is interesting, but that's another whole discussion. Not getting into that. But whatever it is the soul is, which according to him is from God, he brings a machlokes if it's from God, meaning a kind of godly thing. I don't know exactly what it means. But they have machlokes if this person has 3 souls or 1 soul. Okay? And then he goes on to say that it seems that he has like both, he brings rise to both sides from the Psukim and from Chazal. He says if you read Parshas Bereishis Kepshita, it seems like it has only 1 soul. No, sorry. It seems like there's 1 soul. I don't understand how he says that, because I forgot how I understood this. There's only 1. Why does it seem to be only 1? Because it says Okay. Now the Ramban translated, so the interesting thing about Parshas Bereishis is that Parshas Bereishis doesn't hold like Aristotle. But it also doesn't hold like...
There you go.
Like...
It's implemented in
not
stages
like,
for Ramban,
no,
right?
So wait. Assuming this discussion that Aristotle said, that like the earlier people only thought only humans have souls. I don't know if Plato thinks that, but he sort of thinks that. But then he comes with this chachma that both plants and animals have souls. Now, assuming that the word nefesh, which is a big assumption, that the word nefesh chaya in Parshas Bereishis means the same thing as soul. Okay, there's 2 things that have nefesh chaya. Okay, there's animals and humans. Plants don't have nefesh chaya in Parshas Bereishis. They're just plants. So this pasuk seems to be some kind of middle shitta, where it's only, again, if you make this assumption that nefesh means soul, that there's only animal souls and human souls. And the Rabban understood that nefesh chaya is a reference to animal soul, not we call it nefesh atnua, the soul that makes animals move. And veha adam is now that because that's what it says in the animal. So nefesh chaya must mean not only human soul. Humans might have another word for their soul, or might have something else. Without nishmas chayim, I'm not sure. So and then he says, since it says vayipach ba'at of nishmas chayim vehi adam lenefesh chaya, seems that before that he wasn't even a nefesh chaya. So there's like 2 versions of the giving. In other words, he sees that there's 2 versions of the story of Bereishis. Whether it happened in time or not, I'm not sure. But he sees that there's 2 ways of reading it. We could say that first the person, forget about plants, because plants don't count for some reason, according to Parshas Bereishis. But the first, we could say one story where first person, human, man, Adam, was an animal. And then, because this is the whole story, he became human, right? So first he was a living thing, a living being, just like the animals were, and then he became a human living being. That's one version of the story, but he says that doesn't seem to be what it says, because it says that he was just earth, which is a totally dead thing. And then, in the same moment as becoming alive, nefesh chaya, he also became human. So there seems the pasuk seems he thinks that the pshat is the first thing. That's his pshat. And if you read nefesh chaya, he became a nefesh chaya. Or you could add, in the other way he says in the end, you could read nefesh chaya as adding a nefesh chaya. Or to the nefesh chaya, he added something else. Whatever. This is weird that you can. Point is, you could read it and tell me. This is one pshat. Or we could have a different pshat where, yes, first the person was an animal and then he added a human soul to it. And that would explain the pasuk in some other way. So he says the pshat is like this, but then he thinks that the Targum Onkelos seems to think that there's different, because he translates Ruach Mamala, and the Ramban makes an assumption that Ruach Mamala means intellectual soul, because it's talking soul, that's how it was called by the Greeks. Or logical soul, like logos, meaning speech and meaning thought. So he thinks that Onkelos is thinking in that language, and therefore he didn't be Ve'yodam l'ruach mamala is not Ve'yodam l'nefesh chaya. So he translated not kepshita that he just became an animal. He was an animal before, but God added only the intellectual soul, nefesh medaberes. So, and then he has an interesting raya. This is the raya I'm going to start you with, from the Chazal. It says we have a raya from a Gemara that their person has two souls. Because the Gemara has a story where Rava created a man. And then he sent it to Reb Zerda, and Reb Zerda said, tried speaking to him, and he couldn't speak, so he said, go back to where you came from. Go back to Vlafrach. Okay, famous story of Rava creating a golem. Yeah, and some people say it sounds like an autistic guy. But, so he created a man. Now, says the Ramban, Hest. So now you understand why the Ramban, he doesn't explain why he thinks there's a rai. If you look at the Batra Koder Bechai, he explains it this way. Says the Ramban, if you could make a golem, well, the word golem, I don't know, wasn't invented yet, but if you could create a man that can't speak, that these are separate souls. Because if a man is only one thing that can both speak and think, or speak, and be a man, then there could not be a golem. Because golems can only exist according to the Shitta that there could be things that look entirely like humans, but don't have a human soul.
What is he saying to him? The min
chavrayat, you're from our friends. In other words, our friends made you, so go back to where you came from. I'm not interested in this. Why was he against the Rava's golem? I don't know. Why he did it? That's what it means. It means since you can't speak, so you're not really a human. You look like a human, so I'm not.
We call them animals.
So then it's an animal.
Yeah, so you could kill an animal.
What's the riot to?
No, he's not an animal. Obviously, he's not an animal. It says but a gavra. If it would say but a chaya, no, exactly. So it's got this. He seems to think that gavra is real. If it says but a gavra, it doesn't say but a chaya. You could make a chicken for Shabbos or whatever, but you can't make a adam. No, like I explained to you, because according to the Rambam, according to the Aristotle, a thing that looks like this would not be able to live without a human soul.
Right.
I'm saying
that's what he's thinking. That's what he's thinking of.
Its form would always be intellect, right? Because it's just the form of the body. So if that body necessarily has intellect...
Another way of saying this would be to think that since there's this third opinion, which he ascribes to Targum Onkelos, is saying that the only God, that's why we need this whole Vipah Vapah, in order to add the Nefesh Maskeles. And since Rava obviously can't do that, he can do everything else in Parshas Bereshit. For some reason he can't do this, because this needs God. So that works only with the shitta that these are two things. According to the other shitta, only God can make even the first one or whatever. It's not. There isn't this chilik where God is making the nefesh maskeles and the rest maybe not. Only maybe if you know Sefer Yetzirah, you could also make it, right? This is the same achloikas as if you could have. That's why I said it's a god. So according to the shitta that they're separate, so and like a computer could be everything besides for a human. Or an AI thing. You can be a golem, but you can't have a neshama. And then you would go into the separable neshama theory. But going to Aristotle's theory, does nothing. The question doesn't even begin because he doesn't have a human body, and he's not even an animal, right?
What are you saying? It's about that.
Or according to I don't know. According to this story, are you allowed to kill this guy? It looks like you're allowed to kill him, right? He's not a mensch b'chlal. According to Aristotle, you can't kill him. He's a mensch. You kill him. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you kill him with a shem. So to see same pattern. I don't know.
According to Aristotle, he can't even exist.
Yeah, it can't exist basically. If it would exist, it would be an animal, not a man. Or,
right.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
It really can't exist if it has this living body. If it does all these things, it either has intellect or it doesn't exist.
Exactly. I mean, no, there's dumb people that exist. This is a little bit weird, radical. I mean. Like you say, maybe it was just a very dumb person. How do you know that But of course, this story is assuming that it's not just a very dumb person, right? It's assuming that it's something that's a person, but except without a soul, right? And according to Aristotle, that's impossible. You can't be a person without a soul. Like you said, either you don't exist or you do have a soul. Or maybe you have a soul that's broken. Okay, we can have all kind of tritzim why there's some dumb people. But you can't actually be, the metaphysics of that story don't work. And then he quotes more Gemaras that seem to think like this, like Leshoines more, that there's soul and they're different there's different parts. And the Zohar definitely holds like this second shitta, but interestingly, the Ramban, who the Zohar people are so fond of, doesn't seem to be machriya. He's like, seems to be okay with having two shittas and with rayas for each. But he does, it's weird because it doesn't really work together with his theory of the soul being Miruach Hashem Agadol, because then it can only be separate, unless I don't know what it means, Miruach Hashem Agadol. But that's another stira in the Ramban that I don't know how we can't talk about now. Okay, that's the story. So, kids, according to Aristotle, you can't make a goylem, and according to Plato, you can make a goylem. That's halacha l'maaseh. So if you want to make a goylem, you have to decide who you hold of.
Yeah.
And that's I showed you the Rambam in the end of this article says that the people that hold that there are three souls said very crazy things. Dvurim megunim, it says here, means absurd things. It's a better translation. And he means, maybe one of the things he's thinking about is making a goylem. But he's probably thinking about Gegulim also and other things that he thinks craziness that happen if you hold of this three soul theory. Okay, sure.